Recently, the term waters of the U.S. has become a hot button issue for most in ag. Here to talk about that issue and help us get a handle on it is our resident ag law specialist, Shannon Ferrell. Shannon, let's talk about this because it really comes down to EPA control of waterways, and that is something we've been dealing with for quite some time.
Right. We've basically had the version of the Clean Water Act that's on the books now since the early 1970s. And the Clean Water Act makes it a violation of the act to discharge a pollutant to a water of the United States. Now the problem has been for years, ever since the act was enacted, there was no definition of what waters of the United States meant under the act. So basically Congress left it to agencies like EPA and the Corps of Engineers to come up with a regulatory definition. And we've gone through several versions of that definition over time, and this is the most recent version that we're contending with right now.
Let's talk about that a little bit because there really is still some confusion as to what this version is.
Well, we've had, like we said, several different ways that the agencies have tried to define waters of the United States, and most of the time a Supreme Court decision has been what's made the agency change its interpretation because they felt that the agency's interpretation didn't match Congress's intent. And the most recent version of that controversy was in a case called Rapanos back in 2006. And the problem was that the Supreme Court accepted that case thinking that they would announce one rule that would kind of clear up everything, when in fact, no opinion in that case got a majority of the Supreme Court justices. So all the agencies were actually thrown back into a state of even greater confusion about what they could and couldn't do under the rule. And that's what's led the Corps and EPA now to propose a definition that fits to the best of their understanding what the current state of the case law is about the definition of waters of the United States.
All right, so with those definitions, what they proposed, the broad strokes, what is that really going to mean if this becomes the rule for agriculturalists here in the state?
Well, one of the important policy statements that EPA and the Corps have made is that they don't believe that this rule changes or expands the jurisdiction of the agencies as it stands right now. They believe that what they've done is basically write down what the Supreme Court precedents would say waters of the United States means. But some people don't like what the Supreme Court precedents would say, and some people think that the rule, as it's worded, kind of expands that jurisdiction a bit too much. So, what does the rule as proposed say? Well, first off, what it does is it actually deletes a lot of examples of what was considered a water of the United States and kind of clears some of those things up. Another thing that's really important, and I think that's probably good for people that have concerns in the agriculture industry, is that it actually defines some waters that are not waters of the United States. And an important example of that are things like stock ponds or stock tanks, things that have been formed by damming surface runoff before it reaches a stream bed. All of that is explicitly excluded from the current definition.
Now there are some terms though that are causing some real concern for industry groups. And
I think that the real cause of concern that's really gotten most of the industry groups excited and a little bit fired up about the rule is where the EPA and Corps are trying to actually write down the test as they saw it from the most recent Supreme case, the Rapanos case. And in that case, there were two terms used in one of the opinions, not the plurality opinion, mind you, but one of the opinions from Justice Kennedy. They used the terms significant nexus and adjacent waterways. And people are going, what does that mean? What Justice Kennedy was trying to say in his opinion is that even if something wasn't a waterway per se, if it had a significant nexus, which just means a meaningful connection with something that was a water of the United States, that should be under EPA's jurisdiction. And that's why we're filming here today, because we're kind of standing in a ditch, right?
Right.
And this ditch, when it rains, would flow downstream here towards Stillwater Creek, and Stillwater Creek would clearly be a water of the United States under the rule.
Right. Now that brings up, of course, the next issue, which is recently some maps came to life, which have really got people excited. Let's talk about those and what you've learned about them.
And there's been a ton of controversy about the maps being released. And lots of people, when they first see the maps, say, oh no, EPA intends to assert jurisdiction over all the waterways on this map. And if you look at a map of the United States that shows all those waterways, it can be kind of alarming. But what EPA has said is, look, we developed these maps as part of a different data set that really isn't us trying to show these are all the waterways that we could assert jurisdiction over. That wasn't our intent. But the maps were developed during the development of the Rapanos case, and so that kind of looks a little bad to an outside perspective. Still, the maps kind of do illustrate that if you really wanted to push the language to the furthest extent, then you could make an argument that all those waterways would be jurisdictional. And I think that's really the source of the controversy with the industry. It's that EPA may not intend for the language to be expansive, but if someone wanted to push the language as far as the meaning would let it go, then it really could be.
Okay. Now, to that end, I guess the latest wrinkle is we've had action in the House of Representatives Take us through what's happened there and what we might expect to come from that.
Very recently, just last week, the House passed a resolution that would basically bar EPA from finalizing the rule or enforcing it if they finalized it. And the House legislation, it's a resolution, also said that if the rule is to go forward, that EPA has to consult with state and local agencies and with industry groups to try to get a little bit more understanding of the expanse of the rule. Now, we all know that just because the House passed that, doesn't necessarily mean that the rule's dead. There would have to be action from the Senate, and so far we haven't heard anything from the Senate on that point. But the one thing that the House can do if they decide to act without the Senate is that the House does control appropriations. And so if EPA did enact the rule and the House didn't like it, the House could basically zero out their budget for enforcing the rule.
Now, if an individual wants to get involved in this, if they want to make their voice heard, give us some ideas of what they can do and how best to go about that.
And there are two things that you can do real easily if you want to provide some input on the rule. Number one is you can go to regulations.gov, which is the federal government's regulations portal, and you can actually comment directly to EPA on the rule. And lots of people have done that. As of last week, over 200,000 comments had already been received about the rule. So you can go on there. It's got an online web form. You can submit your comments directly through the form, or you can upload a letter. And the other thing that you can do is you can talk to your industry groups, things like Oklahoma Farm Bureau, America's Farmers and Ranchers, or any of your commodity groups. They've all been weighing in pretty heavily with EPA, and you can talk to your industry or your commodity group rep and kind of let your feelings be known that way as well.
All right, plenty of good information to think about. Shannon Ferrell, our ag law specialist here at Oklahoma State University.